My name is Pinkie Mekgwe. I head up internationalization here at the University of Johannesburg. In 2015, something truly momentous happened. The youth of South Africa at several universities across the national landscape declared that silence had all but become South Africa's 12th language around issues pertaining to colonization and repair, and that this silence would be shattered. From Cape Town to Stellenbosch to Wits, across the country, the students used fall language, calling for roads to fall, essentially a call for symbols of colonization to come crashing down, calling too for fees to fall. They called essentially for the re-examination of the conditions of the average South African. And they asked that we reassess the right to education, clearly stating that it had to be free, that it had to be decolonized, and in some instances, that it had to be Africanized.
The young people are saying that there is evidence to suggest that we were duped and hoodwinked, and we need to go back and talk about what actually happened. Young people are saying they find it difficult to imagine that our so-called founding fathers who brokered these negotiations could have been so naive in imagining that they could have constructed viable nations out of the colonial mess they inherited without a major economic development plan, and that these leaders allowed Britain to walk away from the Caribbean after 300 years of imperial exploitation, to walk away without looking at what was required to make these young fledgling states viable. And so they're saying, well, clearly we were set up for failure because they cannot imagine anybody of economic thought that would have allowed sustainable and viable nations to emerge out of the colonial rubble that was left behind. And these conversations, I believe, ought to be had, and young people are quite right to say we need to return to the 60s and see exactly what were the ideas. Pan-Africanism, a relevant political philosophy for this century, and whether we ought to review and find another language. Now, as academics, we are at our best, I believe, when we listen closely to the intellectual anxieties and dynamism of the youth, whose grasp of everyday living.
Africanism excludes other Africans in the diaspora. But that is how colonization works. Colonization and alienation go together. Colonization will even alienate you from your children, from your wife.
In my view, I think that the way Africans respond to colonialism, whether you pursuing reparations or not, it is a reaction of the wounded, and which would not give us a lot of results. I tend to think that the best way to look at the problems that black people have faced is to look at what informed those who colonized us. This is a community of people that had evolved in a place. They encountered problems. The population was exploding in Europe, and thought about a solution. One of the elements within their solution was to go out and look for resources, and therefore to colonize.
We have to start planning global reparatory justice conferences in this century. And I think what you're going to see is a global movement that will eventually help us to get through this period.
Is Pan-Africanism the proper entry point? If we don't go back to that question, I think we miss everything that has been spoken this morning. Partly because I'm not too sure what Pan-Africanism means anymore. Major moves in the Caribbean and elsewhere, but not in Africa, cannot be the entry point into discussing the meanings of Africa. Because Pan-Africanism, the way we understand it in Africa, is a state project began to respond to the everyday needs of ordinary people on the continent. So naturally, there must be a distinction between the kind of Pan-Africanism that we hear about and the Pan-Africanism that ordinary people are yearning for.
It's a good day to be an African in Africa. It's also a good day to be an African anywhere in the world. Is the notion of this essentialism of who or what African or Africanhood should and must be in the 21st century. The African map is one that evokes a lot of resonance, meaning, love, and passion wherever one is, anywhere in the world. I've never seen anybody excited about a map of Europe. I don't know if anybody else, who here can think, or close your eyes and think of the shape of Europe, of decolonizing education. Do we take a Pan-Africanist perspective with all the contestations that it's been imbibed with this morning, useful tensions to wrestle with?
I believe that Africanization is an exercise in memory. It's an exercise in rewriting history. Looking for the people that we have erased over time. The women who struggled for independence, for example. The queer people that we do not recognize. I believe very much in revisionist history. When you look at an event or a series of events from multiple angles and not just from the one that is prevailing, the one that we are used to talking through. Exchanged colonizers, yeah? The white man left, the black colonizer took over. So we enter the conversation about decolonization. So colonization in itself is an exercise in trauma. It's an exercise in dispersoning, in shattering everything you know about yourself, taking away what you own.
I'm quite interested in a question that's often thrown at us students, particularly when we're not as so-called civil as when we're presenting here, when we talk about decolonize now. A question that's often asked by conservative black people and of course white people as well is, what the bloody hell is this decolonization anyway? Does it mean, for example, that you're going to stop using laptops and your cell phones? Does it mean you're going to start wearing Ibe's shoe? Those are the kind of questions we get. If you follow Helen Zille's timeline, you'll see that kind of rhetoric is quite popular and legitimized by a lot of very senior academics within the academy. And it seems to scare a lot of people when you say decolonization, because people want to know what exactly is this thing that you guys want us to get into.
What Afrocentric sense will emerge from the Eurocentric nonsense? How do we ensure that sense emerges? The student that was killed so tragically is one student killed too many. That UJ should take greater responsibility for ensuring that even private accommodation outside the university where its students reside are better taken care of.
My daughter goes to Roseville University, then he starts to and fights with the sculpture. What does the sculpture do? And my daughter is fighting this culture.
It felt for me when I walked today in the campus at Wits much better. I could feel that it's our campus with very few police. I could breathe well, I could move well. It's just a passing point. What will be the role, Pheko, for theologians in this generation around the issue of decolonization? What role the church could play?
Thank you very much to our panel members. Please join me in thanking them.